On a humid morning in June 1992, in the small town of Honda, Georgia, a woman named Patricia Henderson left for work at the local textile mill, just as she had every weekday for the past 7 years. She kissed her 2 children goodbye, reminded her husband to pick up groceries, and drove away in her blue sedan down rural Route 41. By noon, her car would be found abandoned on a dirt road 3 miles outside town, driver's side door hanging open, keys still in the ignition, her purse resting untouched on the passenger seat. Patricia Henderson was 29 years old, a Sunday school teacher, a mother, a daughter, a friend to many in this tight-knit community of fewer than 12,000 souls. She would never be seen alive again. The question that would haunt Cordell for more than 3 decades was not whether she had been taken, but by whom, and whether the answer had been hiding in plain sight all along. Cordell sits in the heart of Georgia's agricultural belt, where watermelon fields stretch toward flat horizons, and the summer heat settles heavy as a wool blanket. In 1992, it was a town where everyone knew everyone, where church attendance on Sunday was as routine as Sunday dinner, where families left their doors unlocked and children played in yards until the streetlights flickered on. The downtown consisted of a single main street lined with brick storefronts, a diner called Rosie's that served coffee strong enough to strip paint, a hardware store run by the same family for 4 generations, and a courthouse with white columns that had stood since before the Civil War. On the outskirts, modest ranch houses with carports and chain-link fences gave way to farmland, long stretches of dirt roads that turned to mud when it rained, and thick stands of pine trees that cast deep shadows even at midday. Eleanor Henderson had grown up in Cordell, graduated from Crisp County High School in 1981, married Robert Henderson 3 years later in a ceremony at First Baptist Church. They lived in a pale yellow ranch house on Sycamore Drive with their 2 children, Michael, age 7, and Emma, age 4. Patricia worked the morning shift at Cordell Manufacturing, a textile plant on the industrial edge of town, where rows of women operated sewing machines in a building that smelled of sizing starch and machine oil. She had worked there since Michael was born, always the morning shift, 7 to 3, home by 3:30 to meet the school bus. Robert worked construction, framing houses for a contractor based out of Macon, often gone for days at a time on job sites across Middle Georgia. On the morning of June 18th, Patricia woke at 5:30 as always. The house was quiet except for the hum of the window unit struggling against the heat. She showered, dressed in jeans and a company polo shirt, made coffee in the percolator on the counter. Robert was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in his work clothes, reading the sports section of the Cordell Dispatch. The children were still asleep down the hall. Patricia poured herself a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard, where a tire swing hung from the oak tree, and Michael's bicycle lay on its side in the grass. The morning was already warm, the air thick with moisture, the kind of day that promised afternoon thunderstorms. She left the house at 6:15. Robert walked her to the car, said something about stopping by the grocery store after work, mentioned they needed milk and bread. Patricia nodded, slid into the driver's seat, turned the key. The engine turned over with a familiar rattle. She backed out of the driveway, waved once through the windshield, and drove down Sycamore toward Highway 41. Robert watched until her taillights disappeared around the corner. He would later tell investigators that this was the last time he saw his wife, that everything seemed normal, that she gave no indication anything was wrong. He would say these things with a steady voice, dry eyes, hands folded calmly in his lap. Patricia's route to work took her south on Highway 41, past the high school, past the Piggly Wiggly, past the Shell station where she sometimes stopped for gas. The drive took 12 minutes in light traffic. She was expected at the plant by 6:45 for the shift change meeting. At 6:53, her supervisor, a woman named Dorothy Crawford, noticed Patricia's station was empty. At 7:05, Dorothy called the Henderson house. Robert answered on the third ring. When Dorothy asked if Patricia was sick, Robert paused for a long moment before saying he didn't know, that she had left for work on time, that maybe she'd had car trouble. Dorothy said she would call back if Patricia didn't show up in the next hour. She hung up feeling uneasy in a way she couldn't quite name. At 8:15, a farmer named James Cutler was driving his pickup truck along Old River Road, a winding dirt path that connected several fields to the main highway. He saw Patricia's blue sedan pulled off to the side, partially hidden by a stand of kudzu. The driver's door was open. James slowed his truck, pulled alongside. He called out, got no answer. He walked to the car, looked inside. The keys hung from the ignition. A brown leather purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet visible inside. A half-empty bottle of Diet Coke stood in the cup holder. The radio was still on, tuned to a country station playing softly. James touched the hood, still warm. He looked around at the empty road, the dense trees on either side, the morning light filtering through the leaves. He got back in his truck and drove to the nearest farmhouse with a telephone. The Crisp County Sheriff's Department received the call at 8:47. Deputy Thomas Riggins arrived at the scene by 9:05. He radioed for backup immediately. By 9:30, 4 patrol cars had converged on Old River Road. Sheriff Harold Mackey arrived at 9:45, a tall man with gray hair and a weathered face who had served in law enforcement for 26 years. He walked the perimeter of the scene slowly, hands on his belt, eyes scanning the ground. The car had been driven approximately 30 feet off the road into a clearing surrounded by trees. No skid marks, no signs of a struggle, no blood. The driver's side door hung open at a 45-degree angle. The seat was pushed back further than one would expect for a woman of Patricia's height, 5 feet 4 inches. Sheriff Mackey noted this detail in his mind, said nothing out loud. Clear's throat deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape. They searched the immediate vicinity on foot, walking in widening circles through the underbrush. They found nothing, no torn clothing, no footprints distinct enough to cast, no indication of which direction Patricia might have gone. The ground was hard-packed dirt and dried leaves that revealed little. At 10:20, Sheriff Mackey called the Henderson residence. Robert answered immediately, as if he had been sitting by the phone. The sheriff asked him to come to the station, said they needed to ask some questions about Patricia's movements that morning. Robert said he would be there in 15 minutes. He arrived in 12. Robert Henderson was 32 years old, a lean man with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands from years of construction work. He sat in the interview room at the sheriff's station with his back straight, hands resting on the table. Sheriff Mackey and Deputy Riggins sat across from him. The sheriff asked Robert to walk them through the morning again, every detail he could remember. Robert spoke in a measured tone, no hesitation, no searching for words. Patricia woke at 5:30. She made coffee. They talked briefly about groceries. She left at 6:15. He watched her drive away. Everything was normal. The sheriff asked if they had argued recently. Robert said no. Asked if Patricia had seemed upset or worried. Robert said no. Asked if she had mentioned meeting anyone or going anywhere other than work. Robert said no. The sheriff watched Robert's face as he answered, watched his hands, watched the way he sat perfectly still in the chair. By noon, the search had expanded. Volunteers began arriving at the scene. Friends and neighbors and church members who had heard the news spreading through town like wildfire. They formed lines and walked through the woods on either side of Old River Road, calling Patricia's name, looking for any sign of her. The temperature climbed into the mid-90s. The humidity made the air feel like breathing through wet cloth. By 2 in the afternoon, nearly 60 people were searching, spreading out in a grid pattern coordinated by deputies with walkie-talkies. They found nothing. The woods remained silent, except for the sound of footsteps through leaves and distant voices, calling a name that echoed unanswered. At 3:30, Dorothy Crawford from the textile plant arrived at the Henderson house with a casserole and a worried expression. She found Robert in the garage, organizing tools on his workbench. Dorothy later told her sister that Robert seemed unusually calm, that he thanked her for the food, and said he was sure Patricia would turn up, that she had probably just needed to clear her head. Dorothy found this response strange, asked him what he meant. Robert shrugged, said Patricia had been stressed lately, though when Dorothy pressed him for details he became vague, changed the subject. Dorothy left feeling that something was off, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. The search continued until dark. Floodlights were brought in, generators rumbling in the humid night. Dogs were called in from the county K-9 unit, bloodhounds that circled Patricia's car, and then set off into the woods with their handlers running behind. The dogs lost the scent after 200 yards, circled back, seemed confused. One handler mentioned to a deputy that this sometimes happened when a person had been transported in another vehicle, that the scent trail simply ended where the transfer occurred. This observation was noted but not yet emphasized. By the third day, the case had attracted regional media attention. News vans from Macon and Albany parked along the main street of Cordell. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk. Patricia's photograph appeared on the evening news, a smiling portrait from her church directory. She had dark hair, kind eyes, a gentle expression. The anchor described her as a devoted mother, a valued employee, a woman with no known enemies. The question posed was always the same in different words. What could have happened to Patricia Henderson? Tips began coming into the sheriff's department, dozens of them, people reporting sightings of women matching her description at gas stations, rest stops, shopping centers across South Georgia. Each tip was followed up. Each led nowhere. Those who knew Robert Henderson said he participated in the searches, that he was out there every day walking the fields and woods with the volunteers. But several people, speaking in quiet voices to deputies or to each other, mentioned that Robert's demeanor seemed odd. He didn't seem frantic or desperate. He didn't break down. He was methodical, systematic, as if he were performing a duty rather than searching for his missing wife. One volunteer, a man named Carl Preston, who had gone to high school with Robert, mentioned to Deputy Riggins that Robert had made a strange comment during a search. Carl had asked Robert where he thought Patricia might be, and Robert had replied, probably at the bottom of a pond somewhere. Carl found the specificity of this statement disturbing. The matter-of-fact tone in which it was delivered. On the 5th day, investigators executed a search warrant on the Henderson home. They were looking for anything that might indicate marital problems, signs of violence, evidence of planning. They found a tidy house, children's toys in the living room, family photographs on the walls. In the master bedroom, they found Patricia's clothes in the closet, her jewelry box on the dresser, her hairbrush on the bathroom counter. Everything suggested she had expected to return home. In the garage, investigators noticed that Robert's truck had been recently cleaned, vacuumed inside, washed and waxed outside. When asked about this, Robert said he always kept his truck clean, that he had washed it the day before Patricia disappeared, that this was his normal routine. Deputies noted the explanation, but found the timing interesting. The investigation turned to Patricia's movements in the days before she disappeared. Co-workers at the textile plant said she had seemed her usual self, friendly and focused on her work. She had mentioned looking forward to a family vacation planned for August, had shown photographs of a cabin they had rented in the mountains. Church friends said she had been at Wednesday night Bible study just 2 days before she vanished, that she had seemed happy, had volunteered to help with vacation Bible school in July. No one reported any indication that Patricia was unhappy, frightened, or planning to leave. This made the theory of voluntary disappearance seem increasingly unlikely. Sheriff Mackey conducted a second interview with Robert Henderson on day 7. This time, the questions were more pointed. Had Robert and Patricia been having problems? Robert said all marriages had their moments but nothing serious. Did Patricia have any reason to be afraid of him? Robert said no, absolutely not. Where was Robert between 6:15 and 8:15, on the morning Patricia disappeared? Robert said he was home with the children, that Michael and Emma woke up around 7, that he made them breakfast, that he was there the whole time. Did anyone see him there? Robert paused, then said no. The children were too young to really remember, and no one else had stopped by. Sheriff Mackey noted the pause, noted the way Robert's jaw tightened just slightly when answering. Investigators examined Robert's work truck more thoroughly. They found nothing. No blood evidence, no signs of a struggle, no indication that Patricia had ever been inside the vehicle. They checked the odometer reading against Robert's account of his movements. He had claimed to be home that morning, but the odometer showed an additional 38 miles that couldn't be accounted for by his trip to the sheriff's station. When confronted with this discrepancy, Robert explained that he had driven around looking for Patricia after Dorothy called, that he had checked places she might have gone before calling the police. This explanation was plausible but impossible to verify. By the end of June, the active search for Patricia Henderson had been suspended. The case remained open, but without new leads, resources were redirected. The story faded from the news. The volunteers stopped coming. The yellow tape around Patricia's car on Old River Road was removed, and the vehicle was towed to the sheriff's department impound lot, where it sat gathering dust behind a chain-link fence. Robert returned to work. His children returned to their routines, and Cordell slowly moved on, though whispers persisted in grocery store lines and church parking lots. Patricia Henderson had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense among those close to the case that the answer was closer than anyone wanted to admit. Clear's throat. 3 months after Patricia disappeared, Robert Henderson moved his family out of the pale yellow ranch house on Sycamore Drive. He told neighbors they couldn't stand living there anymore, that everywhere they looked they saw reminders of Patricia. He purchased a small house in Americus, 30 miles north, a 3-bedroom with a fenced yard and a carport. He enrolled Michael in a new school, found a new daycare for Emma. He told people he needed a fresh start, that staying in Cordell was too painful. Those who heard about the move whispered among themselves. Some said it was understandable. Others found it suspicious that he was so quick to uproot the children from everything familiar. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt that sick twist in your stomach when a story doesn't quite add up but you can't prove why, you might understand what Patricia's mother, Helen Morrison, experienced in the months after her daughter vanished. Helen was 53 years old, a widow who had raised Patricia and her 2 brothers in Cordell, who had watched her daughter grow into a capable woman and devoted mother. Helen had never particularly liked Robert, had thought him cold and controlling, but Patricia had loved him and that had been enough. After Patricia disappeared, Helen saw her grandchildren every weekend, drove to Americus every Saturday morning to take them to lunch, to the park, to give Robert a break as he claimed he needed. Michael, at 7 years old, had become quiet and withdrawn. He no longer played with other children at school. He had nightmares that woke him screaming. Helen would hold him in her lap and ask what he dreamed about, but Michael would only shake his head, say he didn't remember. Emma, at 4, seemed to have retreated into herself, sucking her thumb constantly, carrying a stuffed rabbit everywhere, speaking in whispers when she spoke at all. Helen watched her grandchildren with a growing sense of unease, a feeling that they knew something they couldn't or wouldn't say. In December of 1992, 6 months after Patricia's disappearance, Helen convinced Robert to let the children stay with her for the Christmas holidays. She picked them up on a Friday afternoon, buckled them into her car, and drove them back to her small apartment in Cordell. That first night, as she tucked Michael into the guest bed, he said something that made Helen's blood freeze. He said, "Grandma, do you think Mama felt it when she went to sleep?" Helen sat down on the edge of the bed, heart hammering. She asked Michael what he meant. Michael looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his face and said, "When people go to sleep forever, do you think it hurts?" Helen asked him if he was talking about his mother. Michael nodded. Helen asked if someone had told him his mother was gone forever. Michael hesitated, then said, "Daddy said she's sleeping somewhere where she won't ever wake up." Helen held Michael until he fell asleep, then she sat in the kitchen with her hands trembling, trying to decide what to do with this information. Children said strange things when processing trauma, but something about the way Michael had said it, the specific phrasing, the look in his eyes, made Helen believe there was more to the story. She called Sheriff Mackey the next morning. She told him what Michael had said. The sheriff listened quietly, then said he would look into it, but Helen could hear the skepticism in his voice. The case had gone cold. Resources were limited. A child's cryptic statement wasn't enough to reopen an investigation without concrete evidence. For the next 2 years, Helen saw her grandchildren regularly, but noticed that Robert became increasingly controlling about the visits. He limited them to once a month, then once every 2 months. He said the children needed stability, that too much disruption wasn't good for them. Helen suspected he was afraid of what they might say, but she had no proof, no leverage. She hired a private investigator in 1994. A retired detective from Albany named Marcus Webb, who agreed to look into Patricia's disappearance. Marcus spent 3 months reviewing the case files, interviewing witnesses, examining evidence. He concluded that Robert Henderson was almost certainly responsible for his wife's death, but that without a body, without a confession, without physical evidence, there was no case to prosecute. The psychological weight on the Henderson children became increasingly visible to anyone who spent time with them. Michael developed a stutter. He struggled in school, couldn't focus, was held back a grade. Emma started drawing disturbing pictures in art class, images of stick figures lying on the ground with X's for eyes, dark scribbles covering them like dirt. Her teacher showed these drawings to the school counselor, who called Robert in for a meeting. Robert explained that the children were still processing their mother's disappearance, that they were in therapy, that these things took time. The counselor noted that Robert showed no emotion during this conversation, that he spoke about his wife's disappearance the way someone might discuss a canceled appointment. In 1996, 4 years after Patricia vanished, Robert remarried. The new wife was a woman named Sandra Mitchell, a bank teller he had met in Americus. The wedding was small, just immediate family, held at a justice of the peace office. Helen was not invited. She heard about it from Michael, who called her one Sunday afternoon and told her in a flat voice that his father had married someone who wasn't his mother. Helen asked Michael how he felt about this. Michael was silent for a long time, then said, "She doesn't know what he did." Helen asked what he meant. Michael said he had to go and hung up. The marriage between Robert and Sandra lasted 18 months. Sandra later told friends that Robert was impossible to live with, that he was controlling and cold, that the children flinched when he raised his voice. That there was something wrong in that house she couldn't define but could feel like a presence. She said Michael had told her once in a whisper, "My daddy knows where my mama is, but he won't tell anyone," when Sandra asked Michael what he meant. Robert had appeared in the doorway and told Michael to go to his room. Sandra filed for divorce in January of 1998. She left with nothing, just wanted out. She told her attorney that she believed Robert had harmed his first wife, but that she had no proof, just a feeling that had grown into certainty over the months of living in that house. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves when they gathered at the courthouse or at Rosie's diner for coffee. They all believed Robert Henderson had gotten away with taking his wife's life, but belief wasn't evidence. Sheriff Mackey had retired in 1995, replaced by a younger man named Jeff Coleman who had reviewed the case file and reached the same conclusion as everyone else. But the case remained cold. The file sat in a cabinet in the basement of the sheriff's department, gathering dust, a reminder of questions without answers. For those who have ever felt the weight of a truth you know but cannot prove, who have carried that burden year after year watching injustice go unaddressed, you might understand what Helen Morrison felt as she aged and her grandchildren grew into troubled teenagers. Michael dropped out of high school at 16. Emma ran away at 15, was found 3 days later in Atlanta. Both children struggled with relationships, with trust, with the basic mechanics of normal life. Helen saw them rarely. Robert had effectively cut off contact, claiming the children didn't want to see her, that she upset them with her constant questions about their mother. In 2003, 11 years after Patricia's disappearance, Emma Henderson, now 15 years old, ran away for the second time. This time she went to her grandmother's apartment in Cordell. She showed up at 3 in the morning, knocking on Helen's door with a backpack and tears streaming down her face. Helen let her in, made her tea, held her while she cried. When Emma had calmed down, Helen asked her what had happened. Emma looked at her grandmother with red-rimmed eyes and said, "I can't live in that house anymore knowing what I know." Helen's heart began to pound. She asked Emma what she knew. Emma was silent for a long time, then she said, "I remember the morning Mama didn't come home. I remember more than I ever told anyone." What Emma revealed that night in her grandmother's kitchen would eventually reopen a case that had been dormant for more than a decade, would lead to an arrest that shocked a community that had all but forgotten Patricia Henderson, and would finally answer the question that had haunted Cordell since that humid morning in June 1992. Emma said she had woken up early that morning, around 6 o'clock, to the sound of her parents arguing in the kitchen. She said she had gotten out of bed and crept down the hallway, staying hidden but listening. She said she heard her mother say she was leaving, that she couldn't do this anymore, that she wanted a separation. Emma said she heard her father say, "You're not taking my children. You're not taking anything." Emma said she heard her mother say she was going to work, that they would talk about it later. Emma said she heard the front door close. Emma said she heard her father wait 30 seconds, then grab his keys and go out through the garage. Clear's throat. Emma told her grandmother that she had looked out the window and seen her father's truck pull out of the driveway, following the direction her mother had gone. Emma said she had been scared, that something felt wrong, that she had gotten back in bed and pretended to be asleep when her father returned an hour later. Emma said he had come into her room, stood in the doorway watching her, then closed the door quietly. Emma said she had kept this memory buried for 11 years, had convinced herself she had dreamed it, had been too young to understand what it meant. But now, at 15, she understood perfectly. Her father had followed her mother that morning. Her mother had never made it to work. Her father had come home alone. Helen Morrison sat in her kitchen listening to her granddaughter and felt everything click into place, all the pieces of a puzzle she had been trying to solve for more than a decade. She called Sheriff Coleman at 4 in the morning. She told him Emma was with her and that she had information about Patricia Henderson's disappearance. Sheriff Coleman arrived at Helen's apartment by 5:30. He sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and listened as Emma repeated what she had told her grandmother. He asked questions gently, aware that Emma was shaking, that this was costing her something enormous to speak these words out loud. When Emma finished, Sheriff Coleman told her she was very brave, that he was going to look into this, that she was safe now. The case was officially reopened on July 14, 2003. Sheriff Coleman assigned 3 deputies to review all the evidence, to re-interview witnesses, to build a timeline of Robert Henderson's movements on the morning of June 18, 1992. They discovered that in the original investigation, Robert's alibi had never been thoroughly verified. He had claimed to be home with his children, but Emma's testimony now contradicted that claim. Investigators pulled phone records from 1992, something that hadn't been done originally due to cost and the limitations of technology at the time. The records showed that a call had been made from a payphone near Old River Road at 7:45 on the morning Patricia disappeared. A call to the Henderson residence that lasted 18 seconds. Robert had never mentioned receiving this call. When investigators tracked down the location of the payphone, it was less than a quarter mile from where Patricia's car had been found. Deputies re-examined Robert's work truck, which he still owned, now with 200,000 miles on it. Using luminol, they found traces of blood in the bed of the truck that had been missed in the original investigation. The blood was degraded, but DNA testing, now far more advanced than it had been in 1992, determined it was a match for Patricia Henderson. This was the physical evidence that had been missing for 11 years. Combined with Emma's testimony and the phone record showing Robert had been in the area where Patricia's car was abandoned, it was enough for an arrest warrant. On August 23, 2003, at 6 in the morning, Sheriff Coleman and 4 deputies arrived at Robert Henderson's house in Americus. Robert answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair uncombed. Sheriff Coleman informed him that he was under arrest for the disappearance and suspected homicide of Patricia Henderson. Robert's face remained impassive. He asked if he could get dressed. The sheriff said yes, sent a deputy with him. Robert dressed slowly, methodically, as if he had all the time in the world. When he emerged from the bedroom, he looked at the sheriff and said, "It took you long enough." This statement was noted in the arrest report. Robert was transported to the Crisp County Jail and booked on charges related to the death of Patricia Henderson. The story made front-page news across Georgia. Reporters descended on Cordell once again, interviewing anyone with a connection to the case. Those who had known Robert expressed shock, though many admitted they had suspected him all along. Those who had known Patricia wept on camera, saying they had never stopped hoping for answers. Helen Morrison gave a statement to the press, standing on the courthouse steps with Emma beside her. She said her daughter could finally rest in peace, that justice had been delayed but not denied. Emma said nothing, but her face showed the exhaustion of someone who had carried a terrible burden for far too long. The trial began in March 2004. The prosecution presented Emma's testimony, the phone records, the blood evidence from the truck, and a timeline that showed Robert had the opportunity and motive to harm his wife. Emma took the stand and recounted the morning her mother disappeared, her voice steady despite tears running down her face. She described hearing her parents argue, hearing her father leave the house shortly after her mother, returning an hour later alone. The defense attempted to discredit her testimony, arguing that she was a child at the time and that memory could be unreliable after so many years. But Emma's account was corroborated by the physical evidence. The blood in the truck placed Patricia there. The phone call from the payphone near Old River Road placed Robert there at the exact time Patricia's car was abandoned. The prosecution's theory was this: Robert and Patricia had argued that morning about separation. Patricia left for work. Robert followed her in his truck. He forced her off the road onto Old River Road, a location he knew well from hunting in the area. He convinced her to get out of her car, perhaps under the pretense of talking. Once she was in his truck, either voluntarily or by force, he drove her to a remote location and ended her life. He disposed of her remains somewhere they have never been found, likely in one of the many ponds or bodies of water that dot the rural landscape around Cordell. He then returned to Patricia's car, positioned it off the road, left the door open and the keys in the ignition to make it look like an abduction by a stranger. He drove back to the payphone, called his own house to establish an alibi record of being concerned, then returned home to wait for news. Robert Henderson never took the stand in his own defense. His attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that blood in a truck bed could have come from many sources over 11 years, that a child's memory was unreliable, that the phone call could have been coincidental. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced Robert Henderson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robert showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his face blank, his eyes forward. Emma Henderson sobbed in the gallery, held by her grandmother. Michael Henderson sat in the back row, his hands covering his face. After the conviction, in a move that surprised everyone, Robert Henderson agreed to meet with investigators. In a recorded interview conducted at the state prison in Reidsville, Robert finally confessed. He said Patricia had told him she was leaving, that she was going to take the children and move in with her mother. He said he couldn't let that happen. He said he followed her to work, forced her off the road, convinced her to get in his truck to talk. He said they drove to a hunting property he had access to near Lake Blackshear. He said they argued. He said it happened quickly, that he didn't plan it, that his hands were around her neck before he realized what he was doing. He said he wrapped her body in a tarp and weighted it with cinder blocks. He said he put her in the lake. He said she had been there for 11 years. He said all of this in the same flat, emotionless tone he had used when reporting her missing. Divers searched Lake Blackshear for 3 weeks in the summer of 2004. They found nothing. The lake is vast and deep, the bottom thick with mud and submerged trees. If Patricia Henderson is there, the lake has kept her. Robert's confession provided closure of a sort, an answer to what happened even if it didn't provide a location for burial. Helen Morrison said in an interview after the confession that she could finally grieve properly, that knowing was better than wondering, even if the knowing brought fresh pain. Michael and Emma Henderson both struggled in the years after their father's conviction. Michael moved to North Carolina, changed his last name, and rarely spoke about his childhood. Emma remained in Georgia, became an advocate for victims of domestic violence, and spoke publicly about the importance of children being heard when they report concerns. She said in a speech given at a conference in Atlanta in 2010 that she wished she had understood when she was 4 years old what she had witnessed, that she wished she had been able to articulate it sooner, that maybe her mother would have been found. But she was 4. She did the best she could. Everyone did the best they could with the information they had. The case of Patricia Henderson stands as a reminder that justice can come slowly, but sometimes it does come. That truth has a way of surfacing even when buried deep. That children remember more than we give them credit for, and that the most dangerous person is often the one standing closest. The small town of Cordell, Georgia, has moved on in the years since Robert Henderson's conviction. The yellow house on Sycamore Drive has been sold twice. New families live there now, unaware of the history that unfolded within those walls. Old River Road still winds through the countryside, kudzu still grows thick along the shoulders, and if you drive past the spot where Patricia's car was found, there is nothing to mark it. No memorial, no sign. Just another curve in a dirt road that leads nowhere in particular. Patricia Henderson was 29 years old when she disappeared on a June morning in 1992. She was a mother, a daughter, a woman who went to work one day and never came home. Her case went cold for 11 years until her daughter found the courage to speak, until evidence finally came together, until a community's whispered suspicions were validated by a jury. She has never been found, but she is not forgotten. In Cordell, people still talk about her sometimes, about the case that shocked everyone and surprised no one, about the man who took his wife's life and almost got away with it, about the little girl who remembered. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.